I was elbow deep in my garage, fixing the chain on my kid's bike, when I heard the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. Not the usual lawnmower drone or someone's overzealous leaf blower. This was deeper, meaner. I stepped out onto my driveway and froze. A bulldozer. An actual bulldozer was rolling across my backyard. What the hell? I sprinted around the house, nearly tripping on the garden hose, and there it was, my son's playground, the one I built with my own hands last summer, getting crushed like it was garbage, swings twisted. The slide bent in half. The sandbox, nothing but a crater, standing proudly near the mess, arms crossed and lips pursed like she just declared martial law, was Karina Whitmore, president of the Oak Ridge HOA and self-proclaimed guardian of suburban order. "Karina," I shouted, storming toward her. "What is going on?" "That's my property." She didn't flinch. "Your playground was in violation of HOA aesthetics and encroachment ordinances. We gave you 3 warnings, Nathaniel. 3 fake warnings shoved under my doormat with no dates and no signatures," I snapped. "You had no right to touch anything on my property." Karina sniffed like she just smelled bad cheese. "We voted. The structure was deemed disruptive to the uniform look of the neighborhood." I looked back at the wreckage. My son, Griffin, had just turned 6. That playground had been his birthday gift. I built it over 3 weekends, scraped my knuckles sanding every board. Now it was splinters and tire tracks. "You're going to pay for this," I said, voice low. Karina narrowed her eyes. "The board acted in accordance with our powers. File a complaint if you must." She turned and strutted off like she'd just won a parade. The bulldozer revved and backed out, leaving a trail of gouged-up grass and crushed memories. I stood there, fists clenched, and made 2 promises to myself. 1, I was going to bill the HOA for every cent of damage. 2, if they didn't pay, I was going to lien every single one of their properties until they begged me to stop. The next morning, I was already in front of my laptop before the sun had fully risen, pulling up the county assessor's website and downloading parcel maps. Property lines don't lie. I zoomed in on my backyard. Clear as daylight, my fence, my swing set, my property. No easements, no encroachments. Just a clean rectangle of land I paid for and maintained. Then I opened the security footage. I'd installed cameras on the corners of my house after a previous HOA mishap involving mysteriously disappearing holiday decorations. This time, the footage showed the bulldozer rolling onto my lawn at exactly 11:03 a.m., directed by Karina herself, who waved a clipboard like she was landing a plane. There was no hesitation, no attempt to speak with me, just destruction. I clipped the footage, timestamped it, and saved it to a secure cloud folder. Then I did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I dialed the number for a law firm I used to work at. "Brixton Law," came the voice on the other end. "Hey, this is Nathaniel Marsh. I used to clerk under Alina Brixton about a decade back. Is she still practicing?" There was a pause. "Mr. Marsh, 1 second. A few clicks later, a familiar voice came on the line. "I'll be damned. Nate Marsh. What did those HOA tyrants do this time?" I gave her the rundown. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a long exhale. "They authorized a bulldozer to enter your private property and destroy a structure without a court order, notice of violation, or a police presence." "Correct. That's criminal trespass, destruction of property, and possibly conspiracy if the board voted on it knowing it was illegal." I leaned back in my chair. "So we're not just talking small claims." "Oh no, we're talking civil litigation, criminal complaints, and if we're lucky, insurance fraud. You still have your homeowner's policy?" "Of course," I said. "Good. File a claim. Force them to respond in writing. Meanwhile, I'll draft a cease and desist and a demand for damages. Keep everything documented. And Nate," her voice lowered, "don't settle. Make them bleed." By late afternoon, I had the claim filed, copies of the footage uploaded to both my lawyer and an off-site drive, and a printed copy of the parcel map highlighted in red. I drove straight to the sheriff's office and asked to speak with someone about a property crime. Deputy Wallace met me in the lobby, mid-40s, square jaw, eyes like he'd seen everything twice and was tired of it all. "You're the guy with the bulldozer mess?" he asked, shaking my hand. "Word travels fast. Your neighbor down the street called it in. Said it looked like a demolition crew was tearing through a jungle gym." I handed him the folder, footage, maps, photos, a copy of the HOA's vague violation letter. He flipped through it slowly, taking everything in. "This is clear-cut," he muttered. "We'll open a case under unlawful destruction of private property. I'll need a formal statement. You okay with that?" "Absolutely." We sat for over an hour while I recounted everything. He asked precise, methodical questions. How long had the structure been up? Who gave me notice? Was there any prior conflict with the HOA? I answered everyone. When we were done, he looked up and said, "We'll need to speak with Miss Whitmore next." "Good luck," I said. She doesn't believe laws apply to cul-de-sacs. That night, I printed and delivered a certified letter to the HOA Dropbox at their clubhouse. It included a detailed invoice: labor, materials, equipment rental, landscaping repair, emotional distress, total damages. $23,160. I gave them 10 business days to respond in writing. They didn't. Instead, 2 mornings later, a white envelope with no return address was taped to my front door. Inside was a pink photocopy of a fine for unauthorized backyard modifications and a notice that I was now delinquent on my HOA dues due to non-compliance. They'd tacked on late penalties and interest, bringing the total to over $600. I laughed, out loud, on my porch. They were trying to extort me. I grabbed my phone and called Alina. "They're doubling down," I said. "Trying to find me now," she sighed. "Then it's time to go nuclear." We filed the civil suit that afternoon. Destruction of private property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, negligence, and trespassing. Then came the fun part: lien preparation. See, what most people don't realize is that when an HOA commits an unlawful act that results in a judgment against them, and they fail to pay, you can pursue liens against the association's assets, including common areas, or, in cases of extreme mismanagement, even individual board members under certain state laws. Lucky for me, Oak Ridge was incorporated in a state with homeowner protection statutes that allowed for direct recovery from board officers in cases of gross misconduct. Alina filed preliminary notices of intent to lien against 4 board members' properties, including Karina's oversized colonial with the pink rose bushes and triple-deck patio. If they thought they could bully me into submission, they were about to learn what happens when you cross someone who used to write litigation briefs for a living. Meanwhile, Deputy Wallace returned a week later with news that made my day. "We interviewed the bulldozer operator," he said. Turns out he was contracted under false pretenses. The HOA told him they had a court order. He never saw one, just figured it was legit. Did he give a statement, signed, notarized, and witnessed? That was the nail in the coffin. The sheriff's department filed charges against Karina and 2 board members for criminal mischief and trespassing. They were booked, released, and scheduled for arraignment. When word got out, the neighborhood lit up. I wasn't the only one they'd harassed over the years. Lawn height violations, mailbox colors, even an elderly couple fined for parking their car on the street during a snowstorm. A week later, I was invited to a backyard gathering by a neighbor I barely knew, a retired Air Force mechanic named Doug. When I showed up, there were over 30 people there, residents from every corner of Oak Ridge. Someone handed me a beer. Doug raised his voice. "This is the guy who finally stood up to those petty tyrants." Everyone applauded. For the first time since I moved into the neighborhood, I felt like I wasn't alone. We formed a committee that night, an oversight group to monitor the HOA, push for transparency, and if necessary, campaign to dissolve it entirely. People volunteered to go door to door with petitions. Others started digging through old HOA records. Turns out, the board hadn't held a properly noticed election in 3 years. By the time the court hearings rolled around, we had binders of documentation, dozens of residents ready to testify, and a lawyer who lived for cases like this. Karina's smug confidence had cracked. She showed up to court with a private attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The judge wasted no time. "You authorized industrial equipment to enter a homeowner's yard without a court order or verified violation," he said, flipping through the file. "This is more than a civil matter. This is reckless endangerment." Her lawyer tried to object. The judge shut him down. The court ruled in my favor. Full damages awarded, legal fees covered, and an order for the HOA to cease enforcement of any fines or penalties until a full audit of their practices could be completed. But the best part, Karina was removed from the board by court order pending the outcome of the criminal case. When I walked out of that courtroom, I didn't feel victorious. I felt vindicated. They had bulldozed my son's playground. I bulldozed their whole empire. 2 weeks after the court ruling, the neighborhood had begun to shift in a way I hadn't thought possible. For the first time since moving into Oak Ridge, people were talking to each other for real. Not just waves from driveways or small talk over hedges, but real conversations. There was a shared sense of purpose now, like we'd all woken up from a long nap under someone else's rules. But the real storm hadn't hit yet. On a humid Wednesday morning, I got a call from Deputy Wallace. "There's something you need to see," he said. "You available?" 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from him in a small conference room at the sheriff's office. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were scanned documents, purchase orders, invoices, and a contractor agreement. All of them bore the HOA's letterhead. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "Take a closer look at the signatures." I flipped through the pages. Each document had been signed by Karina Whitmore, but something was off. The signatures were inconsistent, some sharp and angular, others loopy and rushed. The contractor agreement had a date that didn't match the bulldozer operator's work log. The equipment was rented from a company out of county, Wallace said. According to their manager, the authorization form was faxed in with a forged notary stamp. They've confirmed Karina never showed ID, never appeared in person, and the payment came from a personal checking account, not an HOA fund. I stared at him. She paid for it herself. Looks that way. But she listed the HOA's tax ID on the invoice. That's fraud, I said, already feeling the heat rise in my chest. And misuse of a corporate entity, Wallace added. We've kicked it up to county investigations. They're pulling the HOA's financials under suspicion of embezzlement. I leaned back slowly. This wasn't just about a playground anymore. This was full-on misuse of authority with criminal implications. Wallace stood and pulled another file from the cabinet. There's more. We interviewed a former HOA treasurer, a guy named Gerald Pack. He resigned 2 years ago, quietly. Said Karina pressured him to falsify budget reports and refused to give him access to bank statements. He finally walked after she threatened to report him for incompetence to the state licensing board. Wait, the treasurer position in an HOA isn't even state licensed. Exactly. I nodded slowly. She threatened him with something that doesn't exist just to scare him off. She's been running this thing like a dictatorship, Wallace said. But here's where it gets even messier. Gerald gave us a USB drive. It had backups of old meeting minutes, including a recording of a board meeting from last year. He opened his laptop and clicked play. Karina's voice filled the room, unmistakable. They won't fight back. They never do. We fine them, they pay. We tell them it's a violation, they repaint their doors. If someone causes trouble, we make their life unbearable. There was a pause, then another voice, one of the board members, maybe. What if they go to a lawyer? Then we drown them in fees. We've got the reserve fund. They don't. She'd said it like it was obvious, like it was strategy. Wallace shut the laptop. We've handed this over to the DA's office, he said. They're opening a case for abuse of fiduciary duty and criminal conspiracy. Later that afternoon, I drove to City Hall. The petition to force a special election had gained enough signatures, and we were ready to file. Doug met me in the parking lot, clipboard in hand. Behind him stood nearly a dozen neighbors, each one carrying their own stack of paperwork. We walked in together and submitted the forms. The city clerk stamped each one, flipping through them efficiently. You've exceeded the threshold, she said. The election will be scheduled within 60 days. You'll receive notice by mail. Outside, people cheered. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Wait till you hear this, Doug said as we walked back toward the cars. My brother-in-law works in lending. He told me Karina tried refinancing her house last week. The lien blocked the approval. She's starting to feel it, I said. She's unraveling Nate. Someone saw her arguing with a landscaper on her front lawn over a weed abatement notice, her own notice. I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop the corner of my mouth from tilting upward. That evening, I got a call from Alina. The HOA's insurance company reached out, she said. They're panicking. They want to settle full damages plus attorney's fees and a signed letter of apology. I paused. Did they admit wrongdoing? No, but they're willing to state that the board acted outside the scope of its authority and that you bore no fault. They're trying to cut their losses. Exactly. But here's the kicker. If we settle, we can't pursue the liens. I closed my eyes. That was the catch. Decline it, I said. She didn't hesitate. 3 days later, a state auditor arrived at the HOA office. Someone had slipped a complaint through the state's Housing Oversight Board, and they moved fast. Turns out, the HOA had failed to file its annual financial disclosures for 3 consecutive years. That alone was enough to trigger a compliance audit. The results were devastating for them. Over $30,000 in administrative expenses had no receipts, payments made to vendors who didn't exist, a landscaping contract that routed funds through a shell company tied to one of the board members' cousins. When the audit report went public, it was like a dam breaking. People who had been silent for years were suddenly posting in the community forum, sharing their own experiences. One man uploaded photos of his fence being repainted by HOA contractors without his consent because it didn't match the aesthetic. Another woman revealed she had been fined repeatedly for having a bird feeder, even though no such rule existed in the bylaws. The community was furious. More than that, they were awake. At the special election, turnout was the highest in neighborhood history. Every single board member was voted out. In their place, we installed a new leadership team, one built from volunteers who had never held power before, but understood what it meant to live under someone else's thumb. I didn't run for a position. I didn't need to. I'd done what I came to do. A month later, Griffin and I stood together in the backyard. The new play structure was twice the size of the old one, with a lookout tower, a climbing net, and a racing slide. He climbed to the top and waved down at me. "You think they'll knock this one down too?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not a chance." He grinned and launched himself down the slide. As he landed on the padded mulch below, I glanced toward the street. A "for sale" sign stood in front of Karina's house. It had been there for 2 weeks. No offers. I didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't the point. I felt like we had taken something back. Not just our yards or our autonomy, but our right to live without fear of the people who were supposed to serve us. And that was worth every fight. The morning after the election results were certified, I found a cardboard envelope wedged between my screen door and handle. No name, no return address, just a single word in bold marker across the front: evidence. I took it inside, laid it on the dining table, and opened it carefully. Inside were 15 pages of printed emails, all from the HOA's internal mailing list, and they were explosive. Karina had been directing board members to delete digital records, backdate meeting minutes, and fabricate approval votes for expenditures, some of which had already been investigated in the financial audit. But these emails made it clear none of it had been accidental. She had orchestrated a full-scale cover-up. One message, dated 3 days after the bulldozer incident, read, "If anyone asks, we had a signed complaint from the Marsh family's neighbor on file. I'll handle the rest. Don't mention the equipment rental in writing." She hadn't just committed fraud, she had pulled others into it, instructed them to falsify public records, and tried to manipulate the paper trail to cover her tracks. I called Wallace immediately. He met me in my driveway less than an hour later, cruiser idling at the curb. He took the envelope, flipped through the pages while standing on the hood of his car, and whistled under his breath. "This is more than enough for a conspiracy charge," he said. "It also blows a hole through her defense from the civil case. She can't claim ignorance anymore." "Who sent it?" I asked. He shrugged. "No idea. Could have been a board member looking to cut a deal. If we figure out who, we might get everything else she's been hiding." He folded the envelope back up and slid it into a plastic evidence bag. "County prosecutors gonna love this," he added before driving off. By the end of that week, subpoenas were flying. The DA's office brought in a forensic IT team to recover deleted HOA emails. They seized 2 desktop computers from the HOA clubhouse and froze the remaining bank accounts under suspicion of further misuse of funds. The state's housing department issued a cease operations order, suspending the HOA's authority until the criminal case concluded. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge had no governing board. And things didn't fall apart, in fact, they got better. Volunteers took over maintenance duties. Neighbors coordinated trash pickup and landscaping through group chats and weekend work parties. Without the constant threat of fines or arbitrary rules, people started fixing up their homes on their own terms. One guy even repainted his house a deep forest green, something that would have triggered a violation letter in the past. But instead of complaints, he got compliments. And then, just when I thought the worst was behind us, a letter arrived from the Department of Insurance. It was addressed to me and marked as a copy of a formal investigation report. Apparently, the HOA had been operating without valid insurance coverage for nearly a year. Karina had forged renewal documents and pocketed the funds that homeowners had paid for coverage. That meant that if someone had been injured on common property during that time, there would have been no legal protection, no medical payments, no liability coverage, nothing. It was reckless. Beyond that, it was criminal negligence. The insurance department referred the case to the state attorney general's office. I was asked to provide a personal statement, which I did in writing, along with the footage of the bulldozer and a notarized copy of the HOA's fake fine notice they had taped to my door. I included the envelope of emails for good measure. 3 weeks later, indictments were issued. Karina was charged with 7 felonies, including conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of property, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and operating a nonprofit organization under false pretenses. 2 former board members were charged with accessory to fraud and tampering with public records. Alina called me the day the news broke. She's not just looking at fines anymore, she said. If convicted, she's facing actual prison time. Any plea deals? I asked. Prosecutors won't offer one without full restitution and a public admission of guilt. And even then, she's not walking away. By then, the new community board had taken over an interim team elected by emergency vote and verified by the county. They weren't flashy. Just regular people who wanted peace and fairness. They started holding open meetings at the public library, broadcasting sessions on a live stream so anyone could watch. I attended the first one, mostly out of curiosity. The room was packed. Folding chairs filled every aisle. Near the podium, one of the new board members, a postal worker named Lydia, stood up and read a motion to formally dissolve the HOA's enforcement authority until a full legal review could be completed. The motion passed unanimously. No more arbitrary fines, no more threats, no more bulldozers. A month later, Karina's trial began. She showed up in a dark blazer, hair pulled tight, face pale. No entourage, no clipboard. Just a public defender and a file folder she kept clutching like it might shield her from reality. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution led with the emails, then brought in the bulldozer operator to testify. He pointed straight at her and said, "She told me the homeowner was out of town and that the structure was condemned." I never saw a court order. They brought in Gerald Pack, the ex-treasurer, who detailed how she had strong-armed him into silence. Then came the forensic accountant, who explained how funds were funneled through fake service invoices and redirected to personal checking accounts. I testified on the 3rd day. The judge asked me to describe the playground, the damage, and the aftermath not just financially, but emotionally. I told them about Griffin's face when he saw the wreckage. I told them about the neighbors who had lived in fear of retaliation for years. I made sure they understood this wasn't about swings and slides. It was about abuse of power. Karina never took the stand. Her lawyer rested without calling a single witness. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty. On every count, at sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. "You weaponized a position of trust for personal gain," he said. "You manipulated, threatened, and defrauded an entire community. You treated your neighbors like subjects. That ends today." She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison with an additional 5 years of probation. Restitution was ordered in full, plus court costs and fines. As for the remaining board members who had cooperated with the investigation, they were barred from holding any fiduciary role in a governing body for life. After the trial, I didn't throw a party. I didn't make a speech. I took Griffin to the park, not the backyard one I'd already rebuilt that, but a real park with a walking trail and a lake and a line of swings that squeaked just right. He raced ahead of me, arms out like wings. I sat on a bench and just watched. For the first time in forever, I wasn't waiting for the next letter or the next threat. The silence was peaceful, not tense. Doug walked by a little while later, pushing a wheelbarrow full of mulch. The city had given us a small grant to maintain the neighborhood common areas ourselves. He nodded as he passed. "We did good," he said. I nodded back. "We did right. And that was enough, not revenge, not even justice. Just the quiet, steady return of something we'd all nearly forgotten how to feel: freedom.